Oh, well, hello there. How are you doing today? I hope you're doing well. There's a big statue in the background there, and there's a big moon. And I have a horse with horns. That's good because so you can steer him, with the horns. You can turn him. So, I've been thinking about some stuff. I made a little video about was Jesus an incarnation of God not too long ago. And by that I mean a couple days ago. And I was kind of thinking about another famous religious leader, Muhammad ibn Abdullah. That's the Muhammad who is the prophet of Islam, you know, the cool guy who united the Arab peoples and started them on their conquest of the world. And like how they spread out all over the place. It was really neat and cool. I personally am very interested in Arab history, or the history of the Arab people, I should say. I have spent a good deal of time researching Arabian history, both Islamic Arabian history and pre Islamic Arabian history. And it's led me to some very interesting little tidbits of information that I've gleaned over the years. And it's also led me to have some opinions on certain figures that maybe perhaps otherwise I wouldn't have really any opinions on, you know what I mean? And I was kind of thinking with my big old, what you call it, openness to religion, it might be worth kind of investigating this whole idea of Muhammad being a prophet. With the whole idea that I'm very into the idea of liberally ascribing certain characteristics to Jesus, for instance, even though Jesus quite possibly never claimed that he was an avatar or an incarnation of God, we could still use him as an incarnation of God. And I think that there's other things we can do there that are a little bit complicated. And I wanted to ask the question, was Muhammad a prophet of God? And was Muhammad a prophet in general? Well, the thing about that is first we have to start with an actual definition. What does it mean to be a prophet? And I kind of looked around and I was considering what we mean when we say someone was or was not a prophet, right? One of the things that I came to, wait, here, are the baseline definition I came to that I think is pretty pretty usable is an individual who is in contact with the divine being. That can extend to prophets not just from the Abrahamic tradition, but also into pagan traditions, because there are pagan prophets, and there's pagan seers and things like that. And it's kind of interesting because in the Bible itself, there's actually some indication that the word prophet used to mean seer, but over time it kind of changed and we started using the word prophet instead of seer for a variety of reasons. And I actually have this is from First Samuel chapter 9 verse 9. Before time in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, thus he spake, came, come, and let us go to the seer. For he that is now called a prophet was before time called a seer. So basically, they used to call prophets seers, but now they call them prophets. It's more of a title there. And the thing that's actually interesting about this is when we think of seers, we think of someone who's, kind of doing divination and stuff like that. But we can read the Bible and see that there are various times when in the Bible they decry divination, using things to try and predict the future or what's going to happen and stuff like that. And sometimes seers are kind of ascribed to be participating in divination or practitioners of divination. So it's interesting that they started using the term prophet instead. Now, one has to wonder, what does this mean in terms of the octopus wants to eat me? What does this mean in terms of Islam? And another verse I'm going to share that it has to do with prophets is also connected. This is talking about Moses. This is Deuteronomy 34, verse 10. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. That's another part of the definition of prophet. Someone who knows the Lord face to face, someone who knows God face to face. At least in this case, they're talking about Moses. Moses knew God face to face. He had seen the face of God. And he saw it and was like, wow, that's real neat. So that kind of begs the question, what are we really talking about when we say Muhammad's a prophet? Generally speaking, when we say that Muhammad's a prophet, we're saying that Muhammad received revelation from God, or at least if we're talking about how Muslims would define it. Muhammad received revelation from God, and his revelation was basically the direct words of God. In the sense of Islam, that's what we're talking about here. And that's kind of an interesting way to look at it, because that means that anything he said that was revelation is, like, supposedly the direct words of God, right? So that's interesting. And that kind of puts it into a different category. However, there are some people who ascribe the idea that this means that literally everything Muhammad does is approved of by God and therefore perfect, or like he's the perfect example. We could kind of pull that apart and we could interrogate that a little bit and see if that's really a good way to define it. Because I think depending on your definition, it would be basically your definition is kind of where I can draw the line of saying yes he is or yes he is not. Which, I mean, that's kind of that's kind of innocuous, That's true of most definitions. If you give me a silly definition, that's probably not going to work. But I looked on a couple of websites, and one of them was Al Islam. Al Islam says that Muhammad is predicted in the Bible. I'm just going to tell you, my view of the Bible is that it is a book that has some very good inspiration in it, has some very good moral lessons and teachings and stuff in it. I do not think it's the word of God. I don't think it's revealed word. I look at it kind of like I look at the Vedas, where I think you can get some instructions on how to live a good life from it if you really want to, and how to connect to God if you really want to. But they talked about a couple of verses, and they were trying to say that these predicted Muhammad. And this one is kind of a long one. This is Deuteronomy 18, verses 17 through 19. And the Lord said unto me, they have well spoken that which they have spoken. I will raise them up, a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee. And when he says unto thee here, he's referring to the Israelites. And will put their brother, oh, I'm sorry. And will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. And it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name. Sorry, I had to write small because was trying to get as much on the page as possible. I will require it of him. So the website tried to portray that as talking about a future prophet that's going to come from, possibly the Arabs, is possibly going to come from the Arabic people, that is going to be, for, basically they're trying to say that this is Muhammad. The truth is, though, that if you read just a few more verses, and if you read the verses before, if you just read Deuteronomy 18, basically, you'll know that this whole thing is actually talking about the Levites. It's talking about they're basically one of the tribes of Israel, and they were kind of like set up to be like not subjugated, but they're set up to be like they do like minor tasks and stuff. Like they like set up the tabernacle and they do some other things. I think they do artistry. I'm not 100% sure on all the stuff they do, but that's their main thing. And here in Deuteronomy 20, but if this continues the verse, is also another reason to say it's probably not talking about Muhammad. But if a prophet presumes to proclaim something in my name that I have not said to him, or he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet is to be put to death. So that's like just two verses after the verses I read previously, which would imply to me that this isn't even talking about a specific prophet. It is saying that God will raise a prophet up out of the Levites who will guide them, who will have the words of God, and he will speak the words of God. Very cool and good. However, if he raises a prophet and then later on they talk about other gods or they do, wrong things there, then, his sentence is supposed to be death. That's less good. However, that does now beg the question. If this is talking about Muhammad, why, or if it's talking about a specific person, why would it say if they do something? Why would it randomly include the idea of like what some runes of what like somebody else might do? Like if this is a prediction about a prophet, that's probably not the way you'd write it. So it isn't about Muhammad there. I think that's a fairly safe thing to say. And they also claim that there's another verse here that points to them awaiting three different prophets, and that one of them will be so great that they're just called the prophet. And this is later on. This is in First John, verse 19 through 21. Now this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, I am not the Messiah. They asked him, then who are you? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. Are you the prophet? He answered, no. So they're basically saying that the last line here, or the website Al Islam is trying to say, that the last line here is, they say the prophet, as if it's someone very specific that they're like looking for, that they're going to be, they're waiting for someone very specific. Truth is, no, there was just a general feeling of like people were basically waiting for prophets at the time. There's nothing specific here. They're not talking about any specific prophet. They're just waiting for another prophet. Like, and something that's interesting is if you read about like this part of like early Christianity or like this time frame, you'll read a lot about the amount of people who were going around performing holy deeds and things like that, and claiming to be prophets, and it was quite frequent. But no, so neither of these are referring to Muhammad. So these are the first two verses I saw people claiming to be about Muhammad, but I think just reading them, it's pretty easy to tell they really aren't. So the Bible doesn't say that Muhammad's a prophet. So that begs the question. What else? Oh my lord, he's very rolly. But then that begs the question, did Muhammad himself claim to be a prophet? Like unlike Jesus, who we could say didn't really claim directly to be God, Muhammad did claim to be a prophet. And we know his story. We know that in 610 or thereabouts, he's very fond of a cave in, I believe it was Mount Hira. He liked to go there alone quite frequently, and he would contemplate and worship Allah. And Allah is just Al-Ilah. So Ilah is the Arabic word for God, and Al is the, so it's just basically saying the God. It's kind of like when you, instead of doing like lowercase God, you put capital God. So nothing crazy there. But he did this. And he did this quite frequently. He was a monotheist. Oh my goodness. He was a monotheist through and through. He goes to this cave. And on one particular night, he goes there and he says that he's basically seized up by a spirit. We will later learn that this is Gabriel, or he learns pretty quickly, I think, that it's Gabriel, the Archangel Gabriel. And the Archangel Gabriel commands him to read. He says he can't read. He says read, says he can't read. I think it was 3 times he was told this, but then on the last one, he basically says, what should I read? And then he gives him, and then the Archangel Gabriel gives him the first verses of the Quran. So it's like, oh, there you go. Hey, that seems pretty straightforward. If that is the story that happened, that seems like it would be, you know, something to at least consider, especially in my very wide spanning view of someone who's, speaking to the divine. And the divine could certainly send angels to talk to somebody, so that's not that crazy. Cool. But there are some other questions. For instance, there's some questions about like the moral activities of Muhammad. There's some questions about like certain things he did that we might find objectionable, even if they're only objectionable by like I'm going over here, sir. But if we're just talking about like what is happening at the time versus what we would accept today, etc. So there are a couple of things I'm going to talk about in this regard, and I think they're kind of important to know so you can at least, as you're forming, like your thoughts about Muhammad, there's a couple of things I think are worth cookbook worth thinking about. So one of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of the negative, or possibly considered negative, was Muhammad's marriage to Zainab bint Jahsh. Jaish? I think it's Jaish. I'm not 100% sure. It's Jahsh. This was his daughter-in-law because she married Muhammad's adopted son-in-law. Muhammad had adopted Zayd, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on here. But originally, Muhammad had encouraged Zainab to marry Zayd. He encouraged her to marry this guy, and at first she was kind of reluctant. Eventually she did. Then there's a couple of stories here, and this the story I'm about to share with you is commonly considered by Islamic scholars to probably be facetious or like made up, basically. But there's a story about Muhammad going to visit Zayd and Zainab at their house, and as he went in, basically the wind blew and it blew open the curtain that separated Muhammad from Zainab, and Zainab was like just in like, I think, just her shirt. Oh my goodness. There, I'll help you later, I promise. But so basically door blows open. He sees her like in just her shirt, and the quote I found, which I thought was kind of funny, but where is it? Muhammad said, "Praise be to Allah who turns hearts around," and then ran away. Well, okay. In one of the narrations I found, he ran away. In another one, he just walked away. But I do find the idea of him just like booking it very funny. Most most Islamic scholars would say that this didn't happen this way, probably just because it doesn't really make much sense. I mean, apparently Muhammad had known Zainab for some years before he encouraged her to marry Zayd. So the idea that he would only suddenly have realized that she was beautiful when she was wearing slightly less clothing seems a little odd. But that's one of various arguments against that. People consider it probably not true, basically. Um, but there is some controversy about this because Muhammad basically the idea is that Zayd divorced Zainab so that Muhammad could marry her. And supposedly they took all of the right precautions, they did all of the right stuff. They waited the allotted time after she was divorced and all this stuff before um Muhammad engaged with her at all, like as in like in any sort of romantic type activities. So I mean, that's not like that's some people consider this very controversial. It's interesting to think about. I mean, willingly divorced her. He wasn't coerced into it, as far as we know. He willingly did this, so it's not like he was like Muhammad's like, "Hey, man, your wife's pretty hot, so I'm gonna need you to do me a favor." It's not like that. That's what happened, So, but no, Muhammad married Zainab after she divorced Zayd. And especially at the time in Arabia, there was a whole controversy about this, specifically because the whole idea was that an adopted son was your son. So basically, this would be like somebody marrying their son's divorced wife. Like that might be kind of weird for a lot of people, and are kind of weird, and some people would consider traitorous, but everybody in the situation seems like they were okay with what happened. It doesn't seem like anybody was forced or anything like that. Interestingly enough, apparently one verse of the Quran was revealed not long after this. Apparently in conjunction with this event happening. And this is Quran, Surah 33, uh, ayat 37, and Surah is chapter, ayat is verse. So basically, chapter 33, verse 37. Behold, thou didst say to one who had received the grace of Allah and thy favor, return thou in wedlock thy wife and fear Allah. But thou didst hide in thy heart that which Allah was about to make manifest. Thou didst fear the people, but it is more fitting that thou should fear Allah. Then Zayd has dissolved his marriage with her with a necessary formality. We joined her in marriage to thee in order that in future there may be no difficulty to the believers in marriage with the wives of their adopted sons. So basically, not long after uh, Muhammad married Zainab, a verse comes along and excuses it and says, "Hey, it's fine." Allah says it's fine, so all y'all get off Muhammad's case. Is basically what happens here. The thing you could argue that it seems a little convenient that this verse would come right at this time. You could argue that that's a little weird, but one could also say that you would also expect God to like look out for his homies. I'm just saying, I think God would look out for the homie. And Muhammad seems like he's a homie. I'd be a homie with Muhammad. But anyway, so that seems to be what's going on there. Another case of marriage that is kind of controversial, or well, more than a little controversial actually, is the marriage to Aisha. There has been some people who try to debate and say that Muhammad didn't really do anything with her until she was older. However, we have in Sahih Bukhari, I believe it was. Yeah, Sahih Bukhari. Basically, we know that Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6, and they consummated the marriage when she was 9. Muhammad was in his 50s by then, and he died when she was 18, and I think he died at like 63. So there is some question, but that would mean like he's like 54 when he consummates the marriage. If I'm correct in remembering the dates right, which I might not be, but around that age. So he was in his 50s and he married and had sex with a 9-year-old girl. This is somewhat troubling to us, as you might imagine, especially in our current day and age where pedophilia is so harmful and often rampant in a lot of places that we really wish it wasn't. There, you could get into the idea of is he a prophet for all mankind, or was he just doing what people would have done at the time? Because at the time, this is not that odd of a thing. We also, like I like Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna married his first wife when she was, or his first and only wife, I'm pretty sure, when she was fairly young as well. They never had sex, and it was apparently a sexless marriage their entire life, so that's a little different. But it's still something to consider, and it's still something to point out and go, hey, like, what does it mean to be a prophet here? Because if you want to say, for instance, that he's the perfect example, the perfect man for all mankind, the one that we should all look up to, well, now you're going to have a bit more of a, like, especially because if you're going to say that anyone at any time should be able to marry a 6-year-old and consummate their marriage when they're 9, all this stuff, that gets a little bit more difficult to approve of. One could argue I'm not the one who needs to be approving of any of this. True. It's the culture of the time. It's not like it's super out of place. However, I would argue that it definitely makes me cautious to say that the man was like some example for all of mankind. We also have the violence. Now, in terms of violence, I'm not going to get into all the little nitty gritty of it. I think, if I remember correctly, of the 199 hadiths that mention jihad, I think in Sahih Bukhari, they're all about war, or there's a large portion of them that are about war. There's something interesting to note about this, in that when Muhammad was in Mecca, and he did not have a tremendous amount of power, especially societal or governmental power, he was completely nonviolent. When he didn't have an army or anything like that, he was completely nonviolent. He very much advocated for making peace among the Quraysh and among the Meccans, and not raising a sword against anybody. After Muhammad goes to Medina, after he goes to Yathrib and it becomes Medina, because Medina means the city of the Prophet and Yathrib was its original name, that is when we get talks and instructions to go to war, to defend yourself. And most verses are in regards to self-defense. One of the verses is, it is your duty to go in. It is your duty to fight in the name of Allah and not exceed your limits. The limits there being, the limits imposed by Allah in warfare. Now, right off the bat, I would have to say, if you're a firm believer in ahimsa, and ahimsa means nonviolence, and if you believe that any enlightened being would not engage in violence, one has to say, in that case, Muhammad is engaging in an activity that we would not see an enlightened being taking on. He's engaging in warfare, You could argue the necessity of it. You could say that he needed to defend himself and he needed to defend his people. There is some debate about that. There's some debate which I've seen people talk about how it seems like some of the actions taken by Muhammad were provocative in nature. They seem to have been striking first in certain cases, and one could argue that he perhaps had the intention of taking Mecca the entire time. There was a war between the Meccans, the Quraysh, and the Medina government. And there's some very interesting things that happen there. Muhammad is said to have forgiven people at several points. There's also several famous incidents involving like executions and things like that. There's a wide variety of activities going on there that could be at least seen as a little bit suspicious. There is some reason to question his action towards certain Jewish tribes. I can't remember. Is it the Banu Tarud? No, that's not correct. I just completely it's Banu something, but there was a Jewish tribe that supposedly betrayed Muhammad and that he basically had put all to death. There's some controversy about this because it seems that the person he elected to be the judge of the Jewish tribe was someone who is a well-known enemy of that Jewish tribe, and then they put them all to death. There's also some things about being able to take women as war booty. Basically being able to take them as slaves. There's a lot of complication here. And what I would argue is that this is what makes me kind of unsure where I would put, because there's this stuff, but there's also some other stuff about Muhammad which is very interesting to hear about. And I excuse me, Mr. Tree Man. And I did write some notes down here from Sahih Bukhari. Man, I had to take a lot of notes for this. I had to write down a lot of verses and things. But this is from Sahih Bukhari, and this is narrated Ibn Abbas. Allah's apostle was the most generous of all the people, and he used to reach peak generosity in the month of Ramadan when Gabriel met him. Gabriel used to meet him every night of Ramadan to teach him the Quran. Allah's apostle was the most generous person, even more generous than the strong, uncontrollable wind, in readiness and haste to do charitable deeds. So, I mean, he's also talking about a man who's really willing to give charity. This is a man who wanted to take care of widows and orphans and wanted to, protect a lot of people. But we also have verses about, being able to beat your wife if she's, not complying, basically. There's, the thing where you warn her, you talk to her, and then on, I think it's the third one, you're allowed to strike her. And depending on how you interpret that verse, that can mean a lot of different things. But I didn't write that one down. It's just one of the various little things that comes to mind. I might do more of these in the future with more detail on certain verses. But, there's all of these things going on here. And this seems to me like this is a very interesting character. This doesn't seem to me like someone who's as straightforward as certain people want to make him out to be. Now, you could make the argument, for instance, that Muhammad was doing what was necessary at the time. Muhammad needed to be a leader of his community, and you know what? At the time, that happened to involve warfare. It happened to involve fighting. It happened to involve getting involved in some stuff that maybe we would rather not get involved with. But what can you do? If you have people who are going to try and take you down, and you have a community to take care of, it's kind of hard to give it up. Like, I mean, think about the Buddha. The Buddha was reinforced by the communities around him, and he got in with the popular crowds. He got in with the um, rich people at the time, you know. But then you also have people like Jesus who wasn't trying to start a whole social reform. You could argue he was trying to start a very spiritual reform and was targeted because of his anti-Roman narratives. You could talk about all of that different stuff. And we can see that the people we consider prophets or incarnations of God and stuff like that throughout history, that's a very wide margin. There's a lot of different things that can encompass. What I think I would say here is it does seem to me that Muhammad was contacted by the divine. It does seem to me that at least some of these verses in the Quran are probably inspired by divinity, and that some of his message is certainly good and certainly worth adhering to. While I would say other parts of his message I find very difficult to accept, and I also find it seems to me very like time based. I mean, the thing that becomes an issue is if you say that he's the last prophet ever and that he's the last one who's ever gonna like talk to God before the end times. Because I mean, okay, now it's been 1400 years. I don't think that's the case, quite honestly. If you want to tell me that he's the last prophet, he's the final prophet, he is the prophet of God, and that everything he says is absolute gold, no, I can't accept that. If you want to say that he has a lot of good things and he has some things in there that aren't super great, I can accept that very easily. I can accept that there's a lot of spiritual wisdom there. I love a lot of the Sufi teachers I've read about, especially like the Chishti order in India and some of the West African stuff I've read about. There's a lot of really great stuff out there. However, the idea that this man is the seal of the prophets, this is the final prophet, the best prophet ever, that's just seems kind of silly to me. That seems like we're shutting out the door, and it's like it's been 1400 years. It's kind of like if you say that like it's kind of interesting because then you could also look at Jesus' message. Jesus' message in a lot of ways makes it sound like things are about to end like any day now. We are now 2,000 years later, things ain't ended. So I think we can safely say that these weren't the end. These weren't the last messengers of God that we're ever going to get. These weren't the last, prophets. These weren't the last incarnations, avatars, whatever you want to call them. Uh, I think that he's very much worth investigating. There's a lot of work that you can find within the Quran. I just don't think it's the perfect word of God. I don't think that he's the perfect prophet of God. I think that he's a cool guy, has a lot of great stuff going on, but he also has some stuff going on that I find objectionable. So, you know, it's interesting. And if you want to follow Muhammad, if you want to be a Muslim, go ahead, man. I ain't got nothing against you. I think all of our paths can lead us to God and lead us to the divine if we truly follow them. And I think if you really hold God in your heart, that it doesn't really matter what religion you choose. That's my thought anyway. But I don't know. I just wanted to share some of my thoughts with you guys. Let me know what you think down below in the comments and all that fun stuff. And have a great day. Bye bye.